receiving the prestigious Belinda Dunn Award, named after someone who I loved and admired and worked with when I was president of the AIDS Action Committee Board, the late, great Belinda Dunn. But what I know of Chastity is just the force of nature that she is around equity, justice, and human rights. And she is just a phenomenal woman. I mean, she's the epitome of the Maya Angelou poem, and we are honored to have her as part of this panel this evening. So welcome, Chastity. Next, we have Paul Glass. Paul Glass is a good friend. He and his husband, Charles, who live in East Falmouth, are both dear friends. Paul and Charles were at Stonewall, so they're not letting people tell them what was happening. They were there and saw firsthand what was happening on that night. Never said if they threw a brick or not, but I think they probably did. It's hard not to have thrown something at that point at somebody. But that Paul has been working after he retired from his career in LGBTQI and in the area of working with older adults, and with a particular focus on BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, and really reaching into traditional LGBT, so we'll talk about that in a moment, LGBT serving organizations that provided great services to older LGBT adults, but really, when you went into these organizations, they were predominantly white, if not all white, predominantly being a lovely way of saying that they were white organizations. And Paul pushed against that, and really, Paul is one of those people who I see as being someone who, when he identifies a problem, he also comes in to be part of the solution. So that he is someone who is not just going to complain about it, he's going to get in and help make it better and correct it. And that's what I love about him. And so he has worked to create LGBT Elders of Color, started out with an event called Flashback Sundays that brought us together, has really been an advocate of intergenerational conversations across the LGBTQ diaspora based on age. And we are absolutely delighted to have him here tonight as part of this panel. So welcome, Paul. And then there's Quincey Roberts Sr., who I affectionately call Q, who I have watched and admire and love for his energy and his commitment. His life's work is about service and advocacy. He's also someone who is, he and his husband, Corey Yarborough, have created organizations that really have changed the landscape of this city and were right on time for what was needed. There were not conversations that were happening within the Black and Hispanic LGBT community, so they created the Hispanic Black Gay Coalition, which was recognized and awarded and rewarded and really created an important space where there was no space for those of us who exist in this city, but didn't have a place where we could just be. And so he created spaces where we could be. Currently, he's the City of Boston's LGBTQ plus liaison, and served as the Education and Outreach Manager for Boston's Human Rights Commission. He was involved with and responsible for the city's Veteran Affairs Services. You name it, he's done it. And he's done it with truth and light and power and gusto and authenticity. And I love him a lot. And so welcome, Quincey J. Roberts Sr., because he's also a dad and his son is adorable. So welcome, everybody. It's good to have us together on a Thursday evening. And so I wanted to start out with my first question, and I always trip over the term queer. And I'm going through my own journey with it. There are a lot of the organizations, the LGBT Aging Network intentionally, and I know that Lisa Krinsky is on here, that the Q is missing from that. It's a loaded word for some of us of a certain generation. I heard queer and usually it meant a fist. or I heard queer and it meant a rock, or I heard queer and it meant that. And I'm trying to make peace with that. But what does queer, the term queer, mean to all of you, and where do we fit in this, where does it fit in this discussion, and where does it fit in our trajectory and our journey? Why don't we start with Chastity?
I knew you was going to come to me with this one. Good evening again, everyone, and thank you for having me. So the word queer, as you were saying, Gary, it could be determined or taken as many different things. So for me, growing up, the word queer is like, oh, you're gay, and that's wasn't the thing to be.
Right.
And even now in today's society, queer is still, especially within the Black community, is just a word, another word to identify gay people. And I say gay people in quotation marks, because if that is what that word is now used to identify people who are gay or lesbian, then we still have an issue of the transgender community being lumped into that, because that plays on that notion that trans women are gay. Right. And that is instilled into a lot of, the cisgender Black community. And so if we're ever going to break down some stigmas, I think we need to come to some clarity around this terminology, because even now when you put up the queer definition, now it's a whole new terminology. It's saying like, oh, it's somebody who's non-binary, or it's a gender identity issue, or whatever you want to call it. People call it so many different things. So for me, it's really a disconnect to me and my community. And I just wish that we had some type of power of who's making these definitions. And so when people Google this, they automatically say, oh, okay, that's what queer means. And now they still using it out of context. So I wish we can, my personal opinion would be to abolish the word altogether.
Quincey, your thoughts?
All right. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about the word queer. I talk about this almost every day, but first I want to thank LexPride, Valerie, for the invite, and everyone on this call tonight or this evening for listening to our stories and listen to us talk. So me being a openly gay, a man from the South, the word queer has always been negative. I cringe as I'm 40 years old today. I cringe when I hear it. I cringe when I use it. But along with what Chastity says, and when we're in these spaces, especially in New England, it's regional. Anything past, I would say Virginia, Southern Virginia, queer is acceptable. Queer is the go-to term. It's the umbrella term. Going back to Chastity's point, we loop everything into queer. Being in Boston for over 15 years now, I know the word is not going anywhere because it's embraced by academia, and academia have money and resources, so they're going to make it stick. So I'm the type of person, I like to lean into problems and issues, or perceived issues and problems. So for me, I had to do the research of the word outside of me growing up in the South. So first things first, open up a dictionary. The word queer simply means different. So what I'm trying to do now moving forward with the LGBTQ plus community is somewhat embrace the word queer and let people understand that it simply means different. It also means that the people that subscribe to queerness, they're different from societal norms. So that's what I'm trying, going back to what Gary said, I'm struggling with it. I talk about it in therapy. So I'm trying to push through my own personal feelings of queer. So I'll stop there.
Great. Paul, your thoughts? You're on mute, Paul. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I've been on the journey with the term queer. And I've about a year ago, I've kind of settled with it. But early on, I can tell you, queer was akin to me as the N-word. And, I'm 72 years old. So I came to a time when queer was weaponized, it was demonized, it was stigmatized. It was all of those kinds of things to make you feel not different, but other. And other in a derogatory way. And it was when I tell you weaponized to the point when you kind of tapped on it in a small way that whenever you hear queer, you could think of being stoned, or you're looking at it, you're looking for a brick to come your way, that kind of thing. And it was a real situation during the time when queer and I was coming out was weaponized and was used as a derogatory term. So it's taken all these years, these decades, for now that queer has been kind of an identity as opposed to just a derogatory term to be to identify folks who are, as Quincey says, different. But I've kind of settled with it. But I know a lot of folks my age and older adults who are part of the LGBTQ community, I just still haven't come around yet. And it's understandable. I get it. And it's a journey for a lot of folks. I'm hearing now that it's still a journey for folks who are, for a different, younger generation, which is, it's odd in some ways, but understandable as well.
It's interesting, and what Chastity has said, and what Quincey has said, and what you have said speaks to what it means to be able to find a space and a place of belonging, and where your identity, your fullness of your identity is represented. It's interesting to me as I look at terminologies that somehow want to shortcut the discussions that we need to have about the fullness of our intersectional being. Sometimes there's not a quick contraction of the things that we are and who we are, and to go to one word to say, okay, well, this is the bucket you're in, misses so much about who you are. So I might be different, but I'm same gender loving, and that's different. I don't feel that that's unusual in a way that stands out from the rest of the world. I don't necessarily see straightness as always being the default normative. I think that one begins to think about these buckets. So when we think about these kinds of terms and we think about them across generations, and how do we begin creating space? And I just say, everybody come off mic so we can have this conversation, not one at a time, but collectively, for Quincey and for Chastity. How do we then begin to move this so that we can own and be a part of owning the discussion rather than having to react to this discussion? Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. I would say more events like this. One thing that sticks out to me, and I said this earlier, I hate preaching to the choir. So when you're going to talk about race, I don't want to talk to a room full of Black people. I want to talk to this room. So more events where if you were going to talk about race or socioeconomic status, about BIPOC queer people, we need to have a different audience. And I think a lot of the new organizations that I'm working with, a lot of the new nonprofits, they're going outside of the norm and they're not preaching to the choir. So I'm excited to see some of the younger generations and their activism. So I would start there and have more conversations like these, because we've had the conversations for over 30, 40 years. However, the conversation hasn't been shaped where it could move the needle forward and make some important changes.
So Chastity, when you think about, we look at the pressure, if we look at these catch-all terms, and then we think about, and I don't know if any of you saw the episode of Armistead Maupin's show, More Tales of the City, but there's the dinner scene in the latest version where a young Black man who's the only one at a dinner party of white gay men and he's dating one of the guys who's there, and they start having a conversation. What he calls out is part of the conversation is transphobic, right? And he names it. And the conversation then turns on him for naming what is happening within his own community, that he's looking at through the lens as a Black gay man, these conversations, and in some ways wondering, so if this is the conversation you're having when someone who's trans isn't here, what are you having when I'm not here?
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm wondering if we can spend a little time talking about the lack of inclusion within our own community. And I know that you, Chastity, and others, Athena and others have taken on the Boston Pride Committee for its lack of responsiveness to the transgender community, particularly to the Black and Brown trans community. And so can we talk a little bit about what that journey has been like, about in some ways being a stranger within your own community?
Oh, yes, this is a loaded question for me, and I'm glad that you asked. I will have to say, first and foremost, taking on Boston Pride was a privilege to do so for my community. I can say it was about 6 years in a row that I was going to them, trying to get them to be inclusive. Can trans women lead the flow? Can we lead the march? It was always a no, 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 no. And so, you can only tell a horse they can't have no water for so long. There's only so much you can do to oppress somebody before they get the strength and the knowledge and the tools that they need to fight back. And that's what we were able to do out of creating Trans Resistance. And happy to say, 2 years later, Boston Pride's board is abolished, and we are creating a new board that I'm currently a part of to create something that is inclusive for everyone. But that's still not going to solve the issue, because there's an issue within the LGBTQIA community. And to be honest with you, we've had a lot of not so nice interactions with a lot of gay and lesbian individuals when it comes to harmful comments towards the trans community, transphobia from themselves. And so I think we need to do a lot of work within that acronym before we can continue this movement of trying to, I know it's a trans movement going on, there's an overall agenda going on within that whole acronym, but it's our time right now. And Paul, you can back me up on this, because my girl, my ancestor, my everything, who gives me willpower to do this work, Miss Marsha Payette No Mind Johnson.
Absolutely.
And people like Sylvia Rivera and Miss Major, like, these were women who were at that fight, starting that fight, and it was taken away from them because we didn't have the resources to continue on. But in today's time, that's my duty to make sure that we do have these resources for the trans community to be able to sustain ourselves. But the problem that we're still lacking is our so quote unquote family under this umbrella still don't see us as equals. And so for me, I know in a lot of presentations and things that I'm doing specifically about trans people is, yeah, you want to talk about transgender and the LGBTQIA community? Because I'm starting to take us out of that acronym, because I'm also doing some work about within the Black community between straight Black men and trans women of color, because we are being murdered by our own Black men. And if we don't start having these conversations, breaking down these stigmas and stereotypes, we're never going to get anywhere. And the first dinner and discussion that we had, most of these guys were saying, I was raised that if a man is dressed as a woman, that's disgusting. Oh, my baby mother told me if I look at a trans woman, she's done with me and I'm gay. And it's this stigma, this rooted stigma that's in our community that's plaguing us. And we need to address that. And I feel like when I bring this up in settings like this or other settings, when it's other gay and lesbian identified individuals, oh, that's not really an issue, and it gets washed under the rug. No, it is an issue, because my people are dying because of this issue. So I think it needs to be addressed more widely about the differences up under that umbrella, and educating our prospective communities, the Black community, Latin, Asian, the differences between a gay man and a trans woman, and start raising these young Black and Latin boys with the understanding that trans woman is just another type of woman. And if you choose to be attracted to one, that does not make you gay. And I think that we need to start breaking that wall down in order to help us save us.
So I wonder with that, Quincey, as you in your role as the liaison, how are you building these bridges? What ideas do you have about building bridges, given what Chastity just talked about? And I want to also name here that internalized, what I refer to as the internalized ish, and ish stands for bullshit. You know, that so many of us have our internalized stuff about how we see ourselves. And so much of that internalized stuff is a derivative of white supremacy and how we've been told to see ourselves across generations, and that we haven't unpacked some of that stuff. But given all of that, how do you begin to break some of this down?
Yeah, that's a lot. And I appreciate Chastity and all the work that you and others have done. And part of the reason, and a lot of people, this is the first time I've actually said this in public, a large part of the reason why I left the nonprofit field was the tokenism. And a lot of what I saw, and it wasn't me being tokenized, it was whatever was the hot issue, and no disrespect to the trans community. Back then it was youth, and Gary can attest to this, Paul, as well as Chastity attest to this. 10 years ago, it was Black boys, right. LGBT youth. So that's where all the money was going. So everybody focused on youth, and everybody else was over here. So now what I see, and that's part of the reason why I left, because we were being tokenized, or we were being asked to tokenize young folks, and that just wasn't what I wanted to do. So I left. And now what I see is deja vu. I see it a lot. I see people, I even experienced it today. It's like, hey, do you know somebody trans? I need somebody trans to do this. It's like, do you need to check this box, or do you actually want to know what's going on in the community? So to answer your question, Dr. Bailey, what I've been doing over the past 3 years, just a civilian outside of the nonprofit world, or Gay Incorporated, as we used to call it, Gay Inc. I've been intentional about bringing as many people as I possibly can from the trans community to speak for themselves. And I'm going to continue to do that. And every opportunity that I have, including this one, I'm always reaching out to someone that's not on the bill, that's normally not on the bill. So I had 2 other events that was scheduled for today, and I'm reaching out to friends that may need some money, may need a stipend, may need to elevate or amplify their mission. So I'm being very intentional about that. And now in my role as LGBT liaison, I can put resources behind that, and I have more of a bully pulpit to play with. So I know for the next 2 years, I've dedicated myself to helping Mass Trans Political Coalition. Trey Andre and myself, we meet like every other week, just trying to figure out how the city, as well as myself, can funnel resources into that community. And then once we stabilize that community, then I'm on to the next in LGBT and so on and so on. So that's what's happening. But I do want to point out that it's a fine line between tokenism and purpose-driven work. So Chastity, discernment. If I could give you any advice from the past, discernment, because everybody's gonna want you around until the next wave comes in.
Well, as we look at this and really think about the Chastity Bowicks of this world, Paul, as we look, and in part of planning this, it was to also want to include the voice of an elder trans person. And what's so interesting is that, I mean, I know a couple of people who said, I don't want to be on display. They didn't want to be studied. And so they didn't want to participate. But, you know, where are those voices in our community? Where are those voices? Are we finding those voices? Are you seeing those voices in the work that you're doing of older trans individuals who are out there wanting to be connected with?
Well, to be honest with you, Gary, I just don't, I'm not connecting with, and I've reached out to as many, oftentimes, to older Black trans individuals, and they're not very forthcoming. I think, it has to do a lot with the history, and they don't want to be, on Front Street, so to speak. And it's a lot for them to come out of their comfort zone, and their comfort zone is being cocooned. And to I think it has a lot to do with the weaponization and the brutalization of the trans community over the years, certainly during my time. And it was not a good time for a lot of folks who were trans or considered themselves trans. And that even when I was coming out, trans was not a term. It was drag queen. And they were looked at in terms of, you're just a man in a dress, and just want to, a man want to wear a dress. And that's all it was about. And it permeated through society, and it was very pervasive within the LGBT community, Black and otherwise. It was just that way, and it was unfortunate, and that it was the common mindset then. But thank God, in more recent times, and with the younger generation, and thank God for Chastity and a generation who have just stepped out. They've always been comfortable within their skin, and there's never been an issue that we need to be in the shadows, or that we need to be marginalized. We need to be amplified, if anything. And I applaud her for being such an advocate, and for bringing to light that they are part of this community more than anybody. And I will tell you, having been, a survivor and a witness to Stonewall, I just happened to be there on a weekend, John from Boston, living in Boston and in New York. I met my husband a year prior. And we would kind of have dating on long distance, and I kind of called myself sneaking off to New York without telling him. And it turns out that both of us ended up at Sheridan Square at the Stonewall uprising, and we didn't even see one another because there was so much stuff going on there. But I can tell you, what tends to get lost oftentimes in history. And in this particular sense, and I can tell you for having witnessed it, Miss Marsha P. Johnson, who was part of that, and thank God, we owed a huge debt to the transgender community, and Marsha being at the lead of it, honey, because she was out there carrying on. And I've read articles and people say, oh, well, she was nowhere to be found, and I don't know why she's getting that. They want to give her credit for starting this revolution. It's like, yes, because she did. I will tell you, I didn't really know who Marsha really was. I saw her, but I didn't know who she was until I, came and to live in New York City. And I was living in New York for over 30 years. But, the times that I would go to Greenwich Village and knowing, kind of being out and about, she was still a force. Years later, decades later, that she was just still carrying on. And when the revolution became the norm, and they were having pride parades in New York City where it started, and it evolved beyond just marching down Fifth Avenue up until just marching through Lower Manhattan, through the Village, and onto Christopher Street. But just when I'm beyond parades, I used to see Marsha on the streets all the time. And she was always her authentic self. But, oftentimes I would find that, people out of ridicule, and this was just in just in the gay and lesbian community as we considered it then, oh, she's just crazy. You say, well, honey, she ain't crazy. You're all crazy for not recognizing her. But
what you're naming is so interesting, is the way in which I believe, and I say this as a clinical social worker and someone who's been doing this for over 4 decades, we always under name and under respect and under treat trauma. Trauma presents itself in so many ways. And when we take racial trauma on top of gender trauma and sexual trauma and all of those things, creating this unholy mess in our bodies and the trauma that gets passed across generations, that we also as a community, as Black, gay, trans, queer individuals, also have our own inherited trauma that has been passed down from our own families, not maybe genetically, but the trauma that gets passed down narratively that we have seen, we have learned as a community. We are recovering still from the loss of 40,000 people to AIDS and not having those lives valued. And to think about now, for people not to realize how many of us in our community died without the recognition, died with a secret. How many of us knew people who everyone said they had cancer, but it was really AIDS and HIV, and they couldn't get how many people were buried not as their authentic selves because people couldn't bury them as the individuals they lived as trans individuals, but needed to, in some ways, recloset them in death. And so I wonder, as we think about the march, the movement forward from our foreparents to where we are now, and we think about the intersection of race and class, where do you see the opportunities for us as Black and Brown LGBT individuals to influence the outcomes that need to happen in our own communities in terms of access and upward mobility? Quincey, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say, as they say, the youth will lead. Young folks are so different now than when I was coming up in high school and even in undergrad. Talking about sexuality has been a thing recently, especially at my alma mater in Raleigh, North Carolina, St. Augustine's College. They hit me up, or St. Augustine's University now. They hit me up and they wanted help starting a gay straight alliance. And I thought that was just like genius for people at a historically Black college and university to want to have a gay straight alliance. And at that time, it was 2019. So things like that, I think we're moving past the keep it quiet in your home, especially, and I'm speaking for Black homes. I think we're moving past that. Yes, we still have a lot of work to do because there are some people that still subscribe to ignorance and don't want their children to wear the color pink. I had that conversation 2 days ago with a cousin of mine, and he's like, "Do you think my son's gay because he likes pink?" And I'm like, no, it's just like, it doesn't work like that. So I think, and even my cousin who used to be extremely homophobic and transphobic, he has evolved just watching me and my freedom, as he calls it. He's like, "You're free." So when he says that to me, I think that's his way of saying, I battle with my sexuality. He always says sexuality is fluid, things like that. So I guess I say all that to say is the conversations are becoming easier. And I think for the four of us and everyone who cares about moving that forward, we need to seize the opportunity. I'm excited about the work that Chastity's doing. I also want to amplify that. Of course, Paul Glass with our seniors. I think that is something that I brought up specifically to our administration in Boston, is like, we have to focus on our LGBTQ plus seniors because they have the historical knowledge. They are the corporate knowledge. And if we lose that knowledge, then you're left with me because I'm next in line and I don't have the knowledge that a Paul Glass or Charles has or Dr. Bailey has. So Chastity and we need to start making sure that we have more conversations with you all and get that knowledge so we can pass it on. So I think we're in the sweet spot now that young folks are willing to talk about sexuality. It's not a big deal. Being gay is not the biggest thing. I do think we need to put a laser focus on the trans experience because young folks are making a mockery out of that, which we need to address. But I do think they're more willing to at least hear us out and make fundamental changes than our older Black individuals that are just stuck in their ways, like my grandmother, my last living grandmother. She's just stuck in her ways, and I'm okay with that. I know she doesn't have that much left on this earth, so I'm not going to put that energy into trying to change her 89-year-old mind. I prefer to change a 19, 20-year-old mind.
Right. And, you know, and what you just said, Quincey, I think is just so important. And to be able, you know, I want to be able in this moment to acknowledge your late mom and the blessings that she put on you. Because that ability to love without always understanding, you know, there are things that we don't always understand, but can I love you through it to get to a place where I can learn to appreciate it, but always love you. So with your grandmother, I think sometimes folks don't understand in our community, we can't always, and I don't want to use the term cancel, so I'm going to say we can't always eject our families and our loved ones. We don't always walk away and ignore them because, you know, family means something different to us as a result of having them disrupted in so many ways. So we hold on even when they're dysfunctional, they're functioning
Love them from a distance, though. You do not have to take, hate from a family member. I'm always preaching that to my LGBTQ plus cousins. You don't have to take grandma's BS. Like it's okay to hang up on her when she gets homophobic or transphobic. It's okay to do that. But love from a distance. That's what I would say.
Exactly. And it's about setting boundaries and creating limits. Now, you were talking about the intergenerational connection. Paul, you have begun, one of the things you were doing that I remember was conversations. I remember at some point it was Lisa Krinsky and Bob, I just blocked on Bob's last name. Bob Linscott. And going to see Selma and then coming back together to have a conversation across generations about a point in history, and then to talk about that through that lens. And Chastity, I'd like your opinion on this too, in terms of really thinking about those batons being passed, of thinking about the intergenerational opportunities to talk to the parents of our movement, to really think about the intergenerational discussions that could be occurring. Thoughts about that, Chastity and Paul?
Well, I would just say that was a wonderful opportunity to have connectivity intergenerationally within the LGBT community. You know, we don't have those kind of conversations that often. And even in forums like this, we just they're important. They're needed, but they don't happen as often as they should. And I think it creates an environment and a space where we can better understand each of our point of view. We understand that we are part of a collective community, and we all matter. And I think that was one of the things that really came out of that opportunity for you know, around the post-Selma movie was for us to come together and have that kind of conversation. And it was a large crowd that came in. There were almost 50 people in the room, you know, and to have you know, everybody heard and just and to have some input, that's a wonderful thing. As opposed, even in forums like this where we kind of talk about it as panelists, but it needs to be the kinds of forums where there are more folks who are able to speak and have their voices heard in a real way, and to be and not to be marginalized, but to be recognized. And I think that's an important piece of it. You know, I can tell you also that, you know, it was a younger generation that brought me around with the term queer.
Right.
You know, I was like, I was adamant. It's like, I am not queer. Don't call me that. I don't want to hear that in my space. I don't want to hear nothing about it. You know, y'all don't know nothing about this, and I'm sick of hearing about it. But it was through some genuine, both one-on-one and collective conversations that you know, kind of made me understand that it was a different. It had a different meaning, and it meant different things to different people. And it wasn't really being considered a weaponized word, but it was more about an identity. And yeah, I think, and Quincey, you have some points, and we have to be careful in terms of how we want to utilize that in terms of having these kinds of conversations, whether it's just something as if it's going to be tokenized or it's really going to be something that's going to be brought to light to induce some change.
So I'm wondering, Chastity, from your perspective, as we think about the community and being able to reach across the generations, and I think of the trans community, when we look at the average age of survival for a Black trans woman is 33 years. I mean, it is not, as I looked at a data set, because of violence. And to really think then about what does that mean in terms of how do you then become an elder? So I'm wondering about your thoughts in terms of this intergenerational connection. How do we celebrate the elders in our community? Do you know who they are as a way of reaching and connecting with them? I'm just interested in your thoughts about this and from the trans community perspective.
Yes, that is unfortunately our life expectancy. So me being a 36, I feel like I'm walking on borrowed time. A lot of us at my age, it's crazy that we have conversations with each other like, so who do you think is going to be next? Like in our community in Boston, is it going to be me or is it going to be you? And we have these really conversations like, well, Chastity, you're out here more than us. So maybe it might be you because you're here and you're there. Or maybe it could be me because I'm doing X, Y, and Z to survive. So we started creating these spaces for ourselves. So here at the Trans Emergency Fund, we started having retreats, and we started with trans women retreats 2 years ago, where we bring together at least 25 trans women of all ages. So our last one that we just had in November, the youngest was 20 and the oldest was 73.
Wow.
And we had a chance to sit down and listen to each other's stories of how things have changed, how things have not changed. And it really opened a lot of eyes to the younger generation, like, oh, this is what happened. And this is why we have some of these rights that we have now because of what you were doing and the person you knew were doing. And was sad to say that first retreats, 2 trans women of color in the generation right above me passed away from COVID, like 4 or 5 months later afterwards. And it's like, if we didn't create that space when we did, we would have never had that time to share with them. And I think it's up to us as community members to make those spaces for our prospective communities. So like coming up in May, we're gonna have our first trans masculine retreat. And then after that, we're gonna have our first gender nonconforming and non-binary retreat, because everybody should get a chance to have this multi-generational conversation. And you talk about passing the baton, like, I'm always telling people I hate being tokenized, and I get tired of people, well, let's just ask Chastity and ask Chastity. No, Chastity has a limit. And also I'm trying to mentor younger trans women, especially of color, to get into the work and to be able to do these trainings and speaking engagements. So you can still reach out to me, but I can be like, nope, I'm not available, but she is, and you're gonna pay her coin. And it's not gonna take months for her to get paid. And so it's these things that I'm trying to set in place now so that I can do what I can do to pass my baton, because it's not about me. It's never been about me. It's about the work. And so I'm so happy to say that Trans Emergency Fund, we now have 5 staff members. I'm so excited.
Wow.
And so you will see a lot less of Chastity, because I need to do what I'm doing in the background to make sure we got funding, keeping these people in City Hall online, making sure I have my meeting with our lovely mayor, who, we got to get our trans housing program off of the streets, because it's up to us to protect our community. And y'all don't see it on the news here a lot, because we're not important enough to be in the news, but we're being beaten and raped and gang raped and things here on a continuous basis. And nobody knows, but we do at the Trans Emergency Fund, because we're their first call. We're putting these individuals at hotels for a week at a time so they can get better and heal after being in a traumatic situation. And it's like, we need these city officials, I look forward to reaching out to you, Quincey, to get on board with this movement, because we're not going away. And we need our community members, especially our gay men of color, to think about this baton and learning from our elders and things of that nature. And I think we need to do it together. I mean, I know quite a few of young gay men of color who need some guidance, bad, because there are things that are going on in our community that we're not talking about that are destroying our youth. Crystal meth. We got gay men now fighting trans women. It's a mess. And if we don't get a hold of it now, we're gonna lose control. Yeah. And so my advice would be to partner together, work together, create these spaces for our prospective communities, but also create these spaces together so we can start breaking down these issues and learning from each other.
Chastity, I asked you to be the beginning, and now I'm going to thank you for being the end. That wraps up beautifully what this conversation has been about, and it could go on and on and on. I want to thank everybody for their participation today, and I want to name a reality. We turned off the chat because the Facebook page for this event had been trolled. And so there was a lot of effort put into making sure that this was a safe space for this conversation to happen. But I also want to identify that we're living in some really turbulent times. And all of the things, or so many of the things that people thought were taken care of, require even more vigilance and energy, because like every other virus, it just gets smarter and changes its shape. And so racism, white supremacy, transphobia, anti-gay sentiment are all alive and well, and that we have our work cut out for us. But I want to say to all of you, with colleagues like these, we're on the right track. But we need other allies. And so I want the Sue Katzes who are there, the Lisa Krinsky's who I know, we can count on my Beth Klingman, Eileen Montour, to join us in this work, and to understand that if we're going to talk about a queer community, it has to include us, and we just can't be afterthoughts. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It's been wonderful. And you can turn on your lights and let us see your faces.
Thank you all for having us.
Nicely done, Gary. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey.
As always, everybody. And Beth Klingman, we have to see one another. It's been years. Where did she go? She went away somewhere. She's here. But thank you all, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining
Chastity,
us.
check your Facebook message.
Got it.
All right. Y'all have a good night.
Good night.
Good to see you, Catherine.
Thanks, Valerie, and thanks for LexPride.
Good
Beautiful,
night,
beautiful.
Love you, Paul.
Paul, thank you. I thought I heard Bob Linscott's voice. Did I?
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you. Bye, Shirley.
Okay, bye-bye.
Gary. Hi, Catherine. Lisa, thank you. Take care, everybody.
Gary, you did a great job.
Thank you.
Terrific.
Thank
For
you.
some reason, my camera won't go on. I don't know why.
Well, you know what?
Email me.
I will. I'm so appreciative. Thank you, Beth. I owe a lot to you, so I want to just acknowledge that.
Yeah, I would love to, reconnect.
Right.
BethKlingman@AOL.com. Email me, so give me your contact info.
Okay, we'll talk soon. Take care.